Thank you so much, Gary, for joining me. It's such an absolute pleasure. You are a hero of mine, honestly. Literally, as a young, when I was growing up as a journalist, I was following all your work from the beginning. So I'm just super excited to have you here today. So thank you for joining me.
Well, that's very kind to Swati. I mean, it does make me feel old, but that's my problem, not yours.
No, I was just amazed by the book. It really is, and before I get into it, because I think Gary, you deserve a fantastic introduction, really, for the just incredible work, a body of work you have, honestly. So, without further ado, so Gary Younge is an award-winning author, broadcaster, and professor of sociology at the University of Manchester. His 2016 book, Another Day in the Death of America, won the J. Anthony Lukas Prize from Columbia University and the Nieman Foundation. In 2009, he won the James Cameron Award for the combined moral vision and professional integrity of his coverage of the Obama campaign. Formerly a columnist and US correspondent for The Guardian, he has also written for the New York Review of Books, Granta, the Financial Times, GQ, and New Statesman. Who Are We was originally published in 2010, but has a new introduction in the 2020 version. So here we are in 2022. And I've got to ask, so what made you feel that 2010 was the right time to write the book and brought you back to it with the updated sort of introduction?
Well, I don't know that I thought 2010 was the right time to write the book, as opposed to I'd been thinking about these things for a while, and it
Mhm.
felt it felt urgent then in a way. We were sorry, let me turn that off. We were 7 years from the Iraq War
Mhm.
starting. We were in the middle of a kind of real feverish state about Muslim and British values and all of that. We just had this huge economic crisis, and it felt then, in a range of ways, like that we were talking that identity in a range of ways was at the forefront of what we were talking about.
Mm.
Um, there would be these peculiar things where in Britain people would say, with regard to religion, we are a secular country,
Mm.
and I'd say, well, we're not actually.
Yeah.
We have an established church. We're actually the opposite of a secular country. But I also knew what they meant, which was compared to, say, America or
Mm.
Pakistan, we are not a particularly overtly religious country. But the way that they were describing themselves was, in fact, wrong. Or they would talk about kind of how arranged marriages were not British. And I think the royal family,
Yeah.
pretty much most 19th century novels, I mean, that is the end of it for the Brontes and for kind of, for Trollope and for kind of. So there was this sense of like that there was an urgent discussion that had to be had, not just in Britain but elsewhere, about um, how we understood identity, and this was a contribution to it. And my basic idea was this: my basic argument was identity is an essential place to start. We all have one. We all have
Mm.
many, actually, but a terrible place to finish in any argument.
Mm.
That when it finishes there, then you end up with fundamentalism. It could be fundamentalism
Mm.
of nation, of religion, of gender, and an essentialism. But that every argument starts from a place, and that place is a culmination of what you think about your experiences. So it would be weird to believe that if I was born a girl in 16th century India, that I would have the same worldview as I do now. The world impacts
Mm.
our understanding of how we understand the place, and so that has to be factored in.
Yeah, for sure. And do you think, yeah, as you mentioned, which is, we have this viewpoint of where we think we're secular. And, we get asked a lot of these questions, especially like, I'm coming from a South Asian background where get asked a lot, like, where are you actually from? So
Mm.
why don't you think we don't question every single identity equally?
I think the more powerful an identity is, the less it is interrogated. So nobody has ever asked me, when did you realize you were straight?
Mm.
Straight people never get asked that question.
Wow.
Nobody ever asked me as a foreign correspondent, how did you balance that with childcare?
Mm.
Because men don't get asked that question. And so, and then, literally, in terms of questions, if you're traveling on a British or American passport, usually people don't say, when are you going home? There's an understanding that, you're going to be out, you're going to be okay. Whereas if you're traveling on a Ugandan passport or
Mm.
a passport from a poorer country, then there's a whole lot of paperwork and a whole lot of suspicion.
Mm.
So there are a range of questions that the powerful are never asked. And indeed, the more powerful you are, the less likely you are to even think you have an identity.
Mm.
So white people don't think of themselves as white people; they just think of themselves as people, and everybody else is a subgenre of people.
Yeah.
Um, and men don't think about, like, well, will it be difficult for me to do that as a man? To
Mm.
go there or to be in this place at this time, because the general feeling is that, uh, broadly speaking, with caveats, as a man, you'll usually be safe. You'll usually be okay.
Mm.
So, yeah, the more powerful identity is, the less likely it is to be interrogated, and the more likely the people that have them are to assume that it's just the norm. Which is
Mm.
why, if you look at the kind of commentariat, which is dominated by not just white people and overwhelmingly men, but like posh white people, like
Yeah.
class is an identity too. And these people have a lot of money and they've grown up thinking that they were going to run the world. And so they think that their ideas are not a product of the world that they grew up in. They think it's a product just of their genius.
Mm.
And things soon fall apart when you say, okay, hands up anyone in this room who's was ever on free school dinners,
Yeah.
or who has a relative who's had an immigration problem or struggled because of Windrush or what. So now what you don't want to do is fetishize those experiences to the extent
Mm.
that, and this is what I mean by, it's a good place to start and a terrible place to finish, is to
Mm.
say, my cousin had problems during Windrush, and therefore you can't argue with me. Or I'm a
Ah.
black man, you can't argue with me. I had free school dinners. I don't care. Like that, your experience is not an argument, but it does
Hmm.
inform your argument.
That's yeah. That really kind of opened my eyes out because I can say I've been guilty of that. Where I've like said, oh, that's my identity, therefore I
Mm,
can claim it, which is so incorrect in so many ways. So I appreciate you bringing that to the book as well. And I found your campaign, just following the Obama and the Hillary Clinton campaign, just really interesting because it was really interesting to see that people really struggled with intersectional identities, as you mentioned with
mm.
the two candidates. And why do you think people really struggle with that sort of multiple identities and you know sort of trying to understand someone from multiple different views?
Yeah, it's a good question. And when I wrote the book the first time, intersectionality wasn't like de rigueur. People were like, I'm that old. People. The issue was not like I invented the issue, but the term, which is used regularly now, was not used regularly then. And
Mm.
um, I think that people have very binary understandings of how these things work, and so whenever anything comes up, which is not exactly complicated, just takes a little bit of imagination. Like, okay, so you're black and you're Nigerian, but you're rich,
Mm.
or you're black and you're male, but you're gay and you're rich, or whatever.
Mm.
People kind of like, what, stay in your lane. Like, I can only deal with one thing at a time, and
Mm.
that we are at one and the same time one thing, which is ourselves, and then we are many things. And I think that people, particularly powerful people, like to reduce you to one thing,
Mm.
which was the weird, in the Obama Hillary campaign, where people were saying, "What will black people do?
Mm.
How will black people vote? And how will women vote?"
Yeah.
And the idea that there was this category called black women who weren't just black sometimes and women sometimes, but were black women the whole time, had just never occurred to them, uh, and funnily enough, black women were not thinking, "Oh my God, like I've been rent apart by these two things." That in this particular moment, they considered Obama something. Something that they might go for. They appreciated the fact that he was standing against a woman, and but that wasn't where their emphasis lay by any manner of means. Could have gone the other way,
Mm.
uh, you know. But black women are very, very used to voting for white men. That's not an issue. Nobody says, ooh, how are they going to deal with that? Um, uh, so it's a very it's a very weird thing, and that kind of the more you get groups like that, where people say, well, black people are very homophobic, and you think, well, the gay ones aren't. Let's start with them, and then where are your stats for that? Where are your so that once you get into intersectionality, the crudity and the essentialism kind of really falls apart. And
Mm.
what I should have said at the beginning, just I do think is interesting, was that the book was written in 2010 when things seemed pretty wild identity wise. But then, there was Brexit, there was Trump,
Mm.
there was the rise of white nationalism. We don't talk about kind of Islamic fundamentalism as much as we used to. There was
No.
Windrush,
Mm.
there, and so that was the the thinking behind bringing it out again with a new introduction was not kind of you were right and you're going to need to catch up, but it's like actually your book is even more feels even more relevant and urgent now than it did when it kind of came out, and the things that you were describing in your are in some ways more evident now than they were before. So
Mm.
let's bring it up to date a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. It was just completely relevant for now. And, for example, the term sort of political correctness is used like, quite a lot these days. So,
Mm.
would you consider like political correctness a disparaging term? Would you say it's used more than before or less than before when you first wrote the book?
I think it's a meaningless term, and that kind of its meaning is to disparage and um, uh, to minimize, to ridicule and lampoon.
Mm.
And in that sense, it's not very different to the way that woke has
Yeah.
been
Mm.
weaponized and leveraged. And I always say when people would say, "Well, it's politically correct," I'd say, "I don't understand what that means. What do you mean?" And they didn't really know. It's like, are you saying that we should be able to just throw the N word about whenever we want? Is that
Mm.
your point? No, I don't mean that. Okay, so are you saying that um, there should be no limits on freedom of speech and people should be able to swear on television before? No, I'm not. Okay, so what are you saying? Don't
Yeah.
hide behind these terms like they used to use the term politically correct policing, which meant
Mm.
not arbitrarily stopping young black men primarily in the street. It was
Yeah.
like, just call it what it is. Otherwise, you could say, oh, Ukraine is fighting its politically correct war. It's like, well, what is the war about? What's it for? So people find these ways to virtue signaling is another term,
Yeah.
where people find these ways to disparage people who I would say who prioritize sensitivity.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean that I have arguments sometimes with friends about like, yeah, I don't think it means that. I don't think I'm saying
Mm.
that. I recently I was talking about another friend, and I said, yeah, he's not a dude though. He's not a. I was saying he could do that. He's not so much of a dude. And my friend said, oh, that's really kind of. I think they said it was kind of homophobic, and I was saying that he wasn't like a real man, and I was saying no. I think dude is a kind of somewhat disparaging, playful term, and what I'm saying is that he's not going to go into this thing with the kind of swagger that would alienate other people
Mm.
on the panel.
Yeah.
And I don't think that dude means heterosexual
Mm.
necessarily. I
Yeah.
think it means like just a cocky and
Yes.
but that kind of, so it's not like every single argument for sensitivity has to be accepted. But when people slam politically correct and woke, what they're saying is we are against sensitivity. But of course, they're only against the sensitivities that they don't care about.
Yeah.
That if you start talking smack about the Queen or God or
Yes.
Jesus or the flag or whatever, then suddenly, the anthem. You sit down for the anthem, you see how politically correct they get.
Yeah. God.
You challenge a statue, you see how kind of woke
Yeah.
they feel. They wake up real quick. So, and that's one of the elements that's really important in the book, and that has really come to light since it first came out, was the degree to which identity politics, as it's called, is not just about the left.
No.
That
Not
the
even a bit.
right actually employ identity politics and leverage identity politics in that was Trump's thing. Like,
Mm.
come to me, white Christian America,
Hmm.
and I
100%.
will I will make it okay.
Yeah, 100%. Like 100% that. And actually, you were just saying that was so. Would you consider this term cancel culture also one of those kind of disparaging terms as part of this sort of collection of words people are throwing out there these days?
It's definitely a word that people throw out, and it's definitely used in a very slack way.
Mm.
And there is, because of I think primarily because of social media, it is possible to marginalize someone and to
Mm.
round on someone in a certain way, which is unpleasant.
Mm.
What I find intriguing is the term cancel culture, it rarely applies if someone says something uh, that's understood to be racist,
Mm.
and people complain and they say that we're not going to read your books anymore or whatever, then people will round on that as kind of cancel culture and as people being intolerant and freedom of speech. The same isn't used for, say, or wasn't used in the last 4 or 5 years for, say, anti-Semitism
Mm.
at all. That there were accusations of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, some of which absolutely stood up, and some
Mm.
of which didn't. But when it came to the IHRA, um, a kind of code, if you like, that would sort of regulate speech around Jews and anti-Semitism, um, people said, I didn't hear the freedom of speech people talking about that. I didn't hear
Mm,
anybody talk about, oh, Jeremy Corbyn's been cancelled because he
that's
said
true.
this. So it doesn't apply equally, and that's because I mean, and of course, anti-Semitism is a huge problem, and when people
Mm,
express it, they should be called out on it. And the point I think there is that kind of freedom of speech, first of all, has its should have its limits,
mm,
um, and it doesn't equate to an obligation to offend,
mm,
and it doesn't remove you from the consequences of your speech.
yeah.
If you say something anti-Semitic and you're called on it, then you have to, make a case for what you said, or people are rightly going to say, well, look, screw you, I don't want anything to do with you. So I
Mm,
really don't have a problem with the notion that um, that there are consequences to your speech.
mm,
I do think that in a range of ways, social media can create a kind of herd and a bullying culture. But
mm,
the uneven way in which this term is used is quite bizarre. And I have a good personal example that um, came to in between. I didn't put it in my in the introduction, but it happened several years after I wrote the original, which was myself and Nesri Malik were shortlisted for an
mm.
award, a diversity and inclusion award, um, for our writing.
Wow.
Also included was a writer, I'm not going to name her, who was renowned for her Islamophobic and racist writings.
Oh, geez.
And it was a diversity and inclusion award. And so Nesreen and I wrote to the organisers and said we would like to pull out.
Mm,
We would like to pull out. We didn't say she should pull out. We said this is not something we want to be involved in.
yeah.
Um, we recognize the difference between views we disagree with and views that are beyond the pale. Here's
Mm,
some examples of why this woman is beyond the pale.
mm.
They said you can't pull out,
Huh?
and they quoted, George Orwell and I don't know, Enlightenment values and all of that, as though we don't have freedom of speech. So we just pulled out and we issued a single tweet each, and then we retweeted each other's tweet.
Hmm.
And we vowed not to reply below the line to any of the tweets. So that's all we did. The people who ran the organization, the awards, they went around succeeding in recruiting people to write about how awful we were
Oh,
and how we didn't
God.
respect freedom of speech and how we were no platforming this woman. And I'm saying we are ceding the platform. We're not no
Yeah.
platforming her. We are leaving the platform. We have that right. We have not asked for you to do anything about her. She can say exactly the same thing today as she said yesterday,
Yeah.
if she so wishes, but we don't want to be associated with her. That was it. They got articles in, I think, GQ, in the Times,
What?
in Spiked, all kind of calling on us and our intolerance. When the award ceremony came, we were booed from the stage. We
What?
didn't go, obviously. We were called bullies, and I thought, in what sense are we bullying here? Who are we
Yeah.
bullying? And throughout that time, I swear, we didn't write any pieces, a single tweet, and that tweet related to a 200-word article on my website, and it's just quite a good example of the balance of understanding, misunderstanding, rhetoric, and the degree to which um, um, our right to
Mm,
walk away was not was not understood. We were
mm,
understood to be the proponents of cancel culture. We hadn't cancelled anybody. We were understood to be the people no platforming. We had left the platform. And freedom of speech does not exist in a vacuum from other freedoms, like my
mm,
freedom to live in dignity as a kind of non-white person in this country. My anti-racism is also a very important principle.
Yeah.
Equality is also a very important principle. So I always, and then there is the final thing that when somebody takes to the airwaves or uses their column to say that they've been cancelled, that's obviously fucking nonsense. If it
Yeah.
that you have a column, you're on the airwaves, you've
Hmm.
not been cancelled.
No.
Palestinians have been cancelled.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, there are large numbers of people with no, asylum seekers and refugees. They've been cancelled.
Yeah.
There are a range of people without platforms who've been no platform by the economy, by racism, by nationalism. But the Yemenis, they've been
Yeah.
cancelled.
100%.
But the idea that kind of someone who writes a column that people don't like and complain about, and then gets to write about then why they've been cancelled by those people, they've not been cancelled. Silly.
Jesus. God, that's awful. It's just ridiculous, isn't it? Oh my God. And you're right. There's just this massive imbalance, isn't there? In terms of whose viewpoints are more valid than others.
Mm.
And so, how do we find a balance between, say, being sensitive to other people's needs while like making sure we don't engage with oversensitivity as well?
I think that kind of um, that we approach things from the point of view of kind of equality, decency, and sensitivity. I think that will usually do that kind of um, and some core principles like
Mm.
you know um, uh, I find the issue bizarre. I think that it's an issue of women wearing a hijab to be a very good example, which is that I am against any person or practitioner who insists that a woman must wear a hijab.
Mm.
And I'm against any person, practitioner, or state, and same with the other, who insists that a woman should not wear a hijab.
Yeah,
Because I believe in a
exactly.
fundamental principle that women should be able to choose what they wear.
Yeah,
And I
100.
don't
Yeah,
think that's
totally
difficult.
agree. Yeah,
I don't think that's I don't think that's hard. Um,
no.
uh, and all of the kind of nonsense about, well, do they is it their choice? Is it? It's like, look, I can't open up people's heads and figure out kind
Yeah.
of quite, why they do things. Is it your choice that you're wearing exactly the same clothes as everybody else in your class? I don't know. We do the things that we do in the way that we do. Like,
Mm.
I don't find, and for a lot of this stuff that poses as multicultural dilemmas,
Mm.
it's really not.
Yeah.
That uh, forced marriages,
Hmm.
it's usually kidnapping.
Yeah.
We've got laws
It's like
against kidnapping.
it's a crime, just
Yeah,
through and through.
already.
Yeah.
Arranged marriages are more complicated. And like I said, like it can't just be a coincidence that posh people basically marry posh people.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there is some the nature of the arrangement may be slightly more deft. You may have a choice between one or three or four or five people, but actually, arranged marriages occur in a range of ways in other cultures also.
Hmm.
Um, honor killings.
Oh,
That's
I hate that
murder. We
term.
have
Yeah, I
laws
hate that
against
term.
murder.
Yeah, I
Well,
hate that term.
it's this thing where they choose a group and a practice, and then they come up with a term that only fits that group, like online
Yes.
grooming
Mm.
or honor killings or black on black crime.
Oh,
There's no
God, yeah.
white on white crime,
No.
only black on black crime. Um, and that kind of you think, well, why don't we call posh people who sleep around? Why don't we call that toff bonking?
I'm
And then we
sorry.
can talk about Boris being a toff bonker and
Oh my God.
all
I'm
of
going to
the,
use that now.
and of course we don't. So this term honor killings. it's murder.
Yes.
Just we have a law against murder. We don't need a special name. We don't need it's so. I actually find quite a lot of the um, so-called multicultural dilemmas really not that hard at all. At the
Mm.
moment, there's an issue of a film that's come
Yes.
out um,
Hmm.
about, I think, Muhammad's daughter or something like that.
Muhammad's daughter, and there's a
Yeah,
alleged depiction of something.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't find it complicated. Obviously, they have the right to screen that film.
Mm.
Obviously, people have the right to protest that
Yeah.
film. Nobody has the right to threaten anybody for making the film or seeing the film, but that's different from just protesting it.
Mm.
And that actually, when people say, "Oh, these people they don't understand democratic values," that's what they're
That
doing.
is
They're going out
yeah, that is
protesting your
democracy.
anti-democratic values. Now, obviously, if um, in any way people were intimidated, not felt intimidated, because I can't prosecute that.
Mm.
But if there are examples of intimidation, that's wrong. But
Hmm.
actually, the kind of fault line is like, you shouldn't be protesting this, because to protest this is somehow a violation of, I don't know, of kind of enlightenment, democracy, blah, blah. And it's like, no, everything in this can be understood, can be protected, can be defended. And if people are intimidating, threatening, there is a law for that, and it should be
Hmm.
used. So
Exactly.
uh, all too often, these things are laid out as being some super tricky, how are we going to get through this? See where your sensitivities got us, and also it only gets this far quite often with people who have less power. So with the
Yeah.
Danish cartoons,
Oh.
which was another clear example. Of course, they had the right to publish those cartoons. Of course, people had the right to protest. Of course, those people did not have the right to send death threats.
No.
Like, not complicated. But lost in that story, and I put it in the book, is that
Yeah.
a guy submitted a series of cartoons to the same paper, Jyllandsposten, less than a year before, that mocked Christ during Easter.
Yeah.
And they said, we can't publish those because people will be offended. So then you get to the point of like, well, and this doesn't mitigate any of the rights I spoke about before.
Mm.
It does, however, say, does it matter if these people are offended or not? You have the right to offend, and people have the right to be offended. And all too often, what I see is a particular kind of person who doesn't want to take the consequences for their speech. You
Yeah.
said something racist. I'm saying that you said something racist, and now you're upset because
Yeah.
rather than just taking responsibility for what you said,
Hmm.
tell me why it's not racist. Or tell me, if you want, why you have the right to be racist. Just understand that by the end of your sentence, I might have gone, because I
Mm.
don't have time for that. And so
Yeah.
people, they don't want to deal with those consequences. So
No.
they cry foul before the ball's even in play.
It's so true. It's true. I'm like, I think that's the problem. Is it's not really a democracy, is it? Because none of its, protests are being quashed for, even though it is part of freedom of speech.
Mm.
But the thing is, how do we stop this insane polarization that's happened, especially, with social media? We've just created like this binary, as you say, so how do we come back to the middle where we can just have like a discussion again, where people aren't just like, you are right and you are wrong?
I think that in I think we're less polarized often than we appear. I
Mm.
think our electoral politics are very polarized.
Mm.
I feel like the quote unquote conversation that I see around trans issues on Twitter
Yeah.
is far less full, engaged, nuanced than the conversations that I have with people that I know.
Mm.
Um, I, I found when I was reporting from America on the 2016 election that um, that the Trump supporters that I met were a lot of them were very aware of a lot of his problems. They weren't that bothered about his racism,
Mm.
particularly, must be
Yeah.
said. But they thought he was a bully. They didn't like his tweets. There was a range of things that actually were clear to them, and the conversation was less complicated than you would imagine. So all of which is to say that I think that we perform a polarization
Mm.
that may not be quite as real in our lives.
Mm.
But then the problem is that the electoral polarization is real, and it has produced a series of problems.
Mm.
Modi in India,
Oh God. Yeah.
um, Trump, um, I would say Boris Johnson. And
Yeah.
even when they lose, because we only talk about the ones that won, but Marine Le Pen gets 42% of the vote.
Yeah. It's a lot.
I'm old enough to remember when her dad got 8% of the vote in a European election, and people were like, what the hell is happening? Now it's
Mm.
42% of the vote in a presidential election. So, and then one may argue on the other side, Corbyn, if you like,
Mm.
or Bernie Sanders, or Podemos, or whoever. I mean, I actually don't find them as I don't find them particularly polarizing.
Mm. Yeah.
But some people will argue that they are. Um, so so there is that, and that produces a set of consequences. Trump. There were consequences. There are consequences to Brexit, and there are consequences to. I don't particularly want to reach. Not that I'm in Parliament, but I don't want to reach over the aisle and come to an agreement with someone who wants to send people who have legitimate claims to be in Britain to Rwanda. I don't.
Oh God. What the
Um,
hell?
I want to send them to Rwanda.
Yeah. Yeah. And exactly, this is so relevant to what's happening now, which is how do you find the response to, say, the Ukrainian refugees in the UK in comparison to, say, the Syrian refugees? Because obviously there was a big sort of identity politics at play in this situation where some were seen as like more like our people, in
Mm.
quote marks. And so, what do you think of that response?
I think that I think two things. First of all, the hypocrisy is clear,
Mm.
and um, in the manner in which one group of people is treated as opposed to others, and it's not just clear; it was expressed. It was very eloquently articulated. These people are not from Africa. They look like us.
Mm.
They're white skinned. They've got blue eyes. These are kind of people who you don't think of as refugees. I mean, people were kind of out and proud about their kind of racism and stupidity. It did also show, and this is not a but, it's an and. Okay, we've had how many years of hostility to all kinds of refugees,
Mm,
any kind of refugee. And this was the first time there was any kind of compassion
mm,
for a group of people fleeing war. And so my personal view was this is disgusting. The way that this is playing out is entirely both hypocritical, sort of dangerous, really, and ugly.
mm,
And there is a small opportunity in here to leverage the notion that we should have compassion for people fleeing war and terror. To
mhm.
say to people, hold that thought about how awful it must be to be these
Yeah.
people, fleeing this war and all the bad things that happen. Now, let's see if we can transfer that thought, because for a long time that thought was absent from all politics.
Yeah.
So the idea that there might be compassion for anyone who was foreign and fleeing was absent. Now there's this tiny chink of light, and that's the only thing that way that I can think that that might be leveraged, is to say, okay, so we've seen that it is possible to be
Mm,
compassionate. So then the question is, who does that compassion apply to?
mm.
Prior to this, I don't know that we had seen that before.
No.
So yeah, very low bar. I'm saying there, but it does speak. It really does speak volumes. Right to the point of like who was allowed out of Ukraine was
Yeah.
black Ukrainians,
Yeah.
and
God.
black people who were in Ukraine understood to be less worthy, less valuable, less real than others.
Yeah, 100%. Like, oh gosh, yeah, you can see the definitely the identity politics playing out in real time with this situation. And on that happy note, on that very happy note, fingers crossed. I am a socialist too, so I'm hoping for some hope for the future and some positive change, and we can all bandy together, hopefully. But yes, it's true. But what a fantastic book, Gary, and like huge thanks for joining me today. It's
Thank you.
such a like enlightening and such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Real pleasure, Saswati. Thanks a lot.